Imagine a world filled with people, cities beginning to grow, families spreading across the earth, humanity multiplying generation after generation. The world that began in the Garden of Eden is now filled with life. But something has gone terribly wrong. Violence spreads across the earth. Corruption grows within human society. The biblical text describes a moment when the condition of the world becomes so severe that a shocking decision follows. A decision that would change the entire course of human history. The book of Genesis records that God looks upon the earth and sees something deeply troubling. The thoughts of the human heart are continually inclined toward evil. The earth itself becomes filled with violence. Then the story introduces one of the most dramatic events recorded in Scripture. A flood that will cover the entire world. Rain will fall for 40 days. Waters will rise above the mountains. The world that once existed will disappear beneath the waters. But why did this happen? Why does the biblical narrative describe a moment when God decides to bring a flood upon the earth? What had humanity become that led to such a judgment? And why, in the middle of this story, does one man and his family become the key to the survival of life on earth? To understand the story of the flood, we must return to the world described in Genesis before the waters began to rise. Because the flood narrative does not begin with rain. It begins with the condition of the human heart. Before we continue into the story of the flood, if you enjoy exploring the deeper meaning behind the passages of Scripture and examining how the biblical narrative unfolds step by step, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on the video. This episode continues our study through the book of Genesis, where we are following the early history of humanity and examining the events that shaped the world described in the Bible. Now let's return to the world that existed before the flood. Because the story of the flood does not begin with rain falling from the sky. It begins with the condition of humanity itself. The flood narrative begins in Genesis chapter 6, at a time when the human population has spread widely across the earth. Generations have passed since the events involving Cain and Abel, and humanity continues to multiply. Families grow, communities form. The world that began with the first humans now contains an expanding human society. Yet the biblical text introduces a troubling description of this world. Genesis records that the Lord observes the condition of humanity and sees that the wickedness of man is great upon the earth. The passage states that every intention of the thoughts of the human heart is continually inclined toward evil. This description presents a world in which moral corruption has become widespread. The text also adds another important detail. The earth is described as being filled with violence. These statements provide the context for what follows in the narrative. The flood is not introduced as a random disaster or an unexplained event. Instead, the passage presents it as a response to the condition of the world at that time. In the middle of this description, however, the story introduces a different figure. The narrative states that one man finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. His name is Noah. Genesis describes Noah as a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and someone who walks with God. This brief introduction sets Noah apart from the broader description of human society. While the world around him is portrayed as corrupt and violent, Noah appears within the story as someone who lives differently. From this point forward, the narrative begins to focus on him, because the story of the flood will soon revolve around the instructions that God gives to Noah and the events that follow as those instructions are carried out. The flood itself has not yet begun, but the conditions that lead to it have already been revealed. The account of the flood appears within the early chapters of the book of Genesis, which serves as the opening book of the Bible and establishes the foundation for the entire biblical narrative. The name Genesis itself reflects this purpose. The word means beginning or origin, and the book introduces several of the most important beginnings described in Scripture. It describes the beginning of the world, the beginning of humanity, the beginning of sin, and the early development of human society. Within this broader framework, the story of the flood appears after several generations have passed since the creation of the first humans. The genealogies presented in Genesis trace the lineage from Adam through multiple generations, showing how humanity spreads across the earth. By the time the narrative reaches Genesis chapter 6, the world has become populated by many families and communities. The earth that began with two individuals in the Garden of Eden is now filled with human life. Yet the biblical text presents this expanding world in a troubling condition. Genesis describes a society in which corruption has become widespread. The narrative states that the wickedness of humanity has grown great upon the earth. It also emphasizes that the thoughts and intentions of the human heart are continually directed toward evil. Another important detail appears in the description that the earth is filled with violence. This statement suggests that the corruption described in the passage is not limited to individual wrongdoing, but extends throughout human society. The world that once began as a good creation has now become deeply affected by the consequences of human disobedience. The flood narrative therefore appears as part of a larger progression within the early chapters of Genesis. The story of the Garden of Eden introduces the entrance of sin into the human experience. The story of Cain and Abel shows how quickly violence emerges within the first family. As the generations continue, the text portrays a world in which corruption and violence become increasingly widespread. Within this context, the narrative introduces Noah. Genesis describes him as a righteous man who walks with God. This description contrasts sharply with the condition of the surrounding world. While the broader human society is characterized by corruption and violence, Noah appears within the story as someone who maintains a different relationship with God. This contrast prepares the reader for the central event of the flood narrative. Because the coming flood is not presented as a sudden or unexplained catastrophe. Instead, it appears as a response to the condition of the world described in the preceding verses. At the same time, the introduction of Noah signals that the story will not only be about judgment, it will also include preservation. Through Noah and his family, the continuation of life on earth will be secured. The stage is now set for the moment when God speaks directly to Noah and reveals what is about to happen to the world. After describing the condition of the world, the narrative in Genesis moves to the moment when God speaks directly to Noah and reveals what is about to happen. The text states that God tells Noah that the end of all flesh has come before him. Because the earth is filled with violence through humanity, as a result, God declares that he will destroy both the people and the earth. But within this announcement of judgment, the narrative introduces a command that will shape the entire story of the flood. God instructs Noah to build an ark. The passage provides specific details about the construction of this vessel. The ark is to be made of gopher wood and covered inside and outside with pitch. Its measurements are described in precise terms: 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in width, and 30 cubits in height. The ark is also described as having multiple levels and a window near the top, along with a door placed in its side. These architectural details are notable because they emphasize that the ark is not a symbolic object within the story. It is described as a physical structure built with clear dimensions and specific instructions. After giving these instructions, God explains the purpose of the ark. A flood of waters will come upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which there is the breath of life. Everything that exists upon the earth will perish. Yet the narrative immediately introduces another important element. God establishes a covenant with Noah. Through this covenant, Noah, his family, and representatives of the animal world will enter the ark and survive the coming flood. The text records that Noah is instructed to bring animals into the ark so that life can be preserved. Pairs of living creatures are to enter the ark along with Noah and his family. In addition, Noah is told to gather food that will sustain both humans and animals during the time inside the ark. At this point in the story, the narrative makes an important observation about Noah's response. Genesis records that Noah does everything exactly as God commanded him. This brief statement highlights Noah's obedience, which becomes one of the defining characteristics of his role within the story. As the narrative continues into Genesis chapter 7, the moment of the flood itself begins. God instructs Noah to enter the ark along with his household. The animals also enter according to the instructions previously given. Then the text records a striking detail. After Noah and the others enter the ark, the Lord closes the door. Soon after this, the flood begins. Rain falls upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. At the same time, the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens are opened. The waters rise across the earth. The narrative describes how the waters increase until even the highest mountains are covered. Everything that lives upon the dry land, humans, animals, and creatures that move along the ground, is swept away by the floodwaters. Only those inside the ark remain alive. The waters continue to prevail upon the earth for 150 days. The world that once existed is now completely covered by the flood. Yet the story does not end with destruction. Because after the waters reach their highest point, the narrative begins to move toward the moment when the waters will finally begin to recede. And with that moment, the story will shift from judgment toward restoration. When the flood narrative is examined carefully, several key elements within the text help explain why the event takes place and what the passage intends to communicate. The first element appears in the direct explanation given in Genesis chapter 6. The text states that the wickedness of humanity had become great upon the earth, and that the thoughts of the human heart were continually inclined toward evil. This description is not limited to isolated actions, but presents a broader condition affecting the entire human world. The passage also emphasizes that the earth was filled with violence. These statements together form the primary reason given within the text for the coming flood. The destruction that follows is presented as a response to the widespread corruption and violence that had developed within human society. Another important detail appears in the contrast between the general condition of humanity and the description of Noah. While the surrounding world is portrayed as corrupt, Noah is described as a righteous man who walks with God. This contrast plays a central role in the structure of the narrative. The flood story therefore presents two parallel themes: judgment and preservation. On one hand, the text describes the destruction of the corrupted world. On the other hand, it describes the preservation of life through Noah, his family, and the animals brought into the ark. The ark itself becomes the central instrument through which preservation occurs. The detailed instructions given for its construction highlight its importance within the narrative. The ark functions not only as a place of safety during the flood, but also as the means through which life continues after the waters recede. Another significant moment appears in Genesis chapter 8, when the text records that God remembers Noah. This statement does not imply that God had forgotten him. Within the language of the biblical narrative, the phrase "God remembered" often signals the moment when divine action begins to move the story toward restoration. Shortly after this statement, the waters begin to recede, and the ark eventually comes to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. Noah later sends out birds to determine whether the land has reappeared. First a raven is released, and later a dove. The dove eventually returns with an olive leaf in its beak, signaling that vegetation has begun to grow again. This moment marks a turning point in the narrative. The destruction caused by the flood is beginning to give way to renewal. The final section of the story appears in Genesis chapter 9, where God establishes a covenant with Noah and his descendants. This covenant includes the promise that the earth will never again be destroyed by a flood. The sign of this covenant is the rainbow placed in the clouds. Within the narrative structure, this covenant becomes the concluding element of the flood story. It moves the story beyond the destruction itself and establishes a new relationship between God and the world that continues after the flood. Through these elements, the flood narrative presents more than a story of catastrophe. It presents a sequence that moves from corruption to judgment and finally to restoration. Understanding these stages helps clarify how the text frames the meaning of the flood within the broader story of Genesis. The flood narrative carries several important implications within the broader story of Genesis and the biblical understanding of humanity's relationship with God. One of the most immediate implications concerns the seriousness with which the text presents human corruption. The description given in Genesis chapter 6 portrays a world in which violence and wickedness have become deeply embedded within society. The text does not describe a single event or a limited group of wrongdoers. Instead, it presents a condition affecting the entire human world. This description emphasizes the depth of the moral crisis that precedes the flood. The narrative therefore frames the flood as a response to a world that had moved far from the order and goodness described in the opening chapter of Genesis. The earth that had once been declared very good had become filled with violence and corruption. Another important implication appears in the role of Noah within the story. The text repeatedly emphasizes that Noah walks with God and obeys the instructions that he receives. Each time God gives a command regarding the construction of the ark or the preparation for the flood, the narrative records that Noah acts according to those instructions. This emphasis highlights obedience as a defining characteristic of Noah's role. Through Noah, the story introduces the theme that even within a corrupted world, faithfulness and obedience remain possible. Noah becomes the individual through whom life is preserved during the flood. The ark itself also carries an important narrative function. Within the story, it represents the place where life is protected while the floodwaters cover the earth. Every human and animal that survives the flood does so because it enters the ark before the waters begin to rise. The ark therefore becomes a symbol of preservation within the midst of judgment. Another major implication appears in the covenant established after the flood. Genesis chapter 9 records that God makes a covenant not only with Noah and his descendants, but with every living creature that came out of the ark. This covenant includes a promise that the earth will never again be destroyed by a flood. The rainbow is introduced as the sign of this covenant. The appearance of the rainbow in the clouds becomes a reminder of the promise made after the flood. Within the narrative, this moment marks a transition from the destruction that occurred during the flood to a renewed relationship between God and the world. The flood story therefore contains both judgment and restoration. The destruction of the corrupted world is followed by the preservation of life and the establishment of a covenant that shapes the future of the human story. Within the larger structure of Genesis, this event becomes one of the defining moments in early human history. The generations that follow will all descend from the family that survived within the ark. The world after the flood becomes the setting in which the next stages of the biblical narrative will unfold. Through the flood narrative, Genesis presents a dramatic moment in which the condition of humanity, the justice of God, and the preservation of life intersect within a single story. And that story does not end with the waters of the flood, because the world that emerges after the flood will soon begin to develop again, leading to the next major events recorded in the early chapters of Genesis. The story of the flood begins with a world that had lost its direction. Humanity had multiplied across the earth, communities had formed, civilization had begun to grow. Yet the biblical narrative describes a condition in which violence and corruption had spread throughout the human world. The earth that once began as a good creation had become filled with wrongdoing. Genesis records that God saw the condition of humanity and declared that the earth had become corrupted through human actions. Within that moment, the decision to bring a flood upon the earth appears in the narrative as a response to that condition. The waters rise. Rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. The fountains of the deep break open, and the world that once existed disappears beneath the flood. Yet the story does not end with destruction. At the center of the narrative stands Noah. While the surrounding world is described as corrupt, Noah is introduced as a man who walks with God. Through his obedience, an ark is built. Within that ark, life is preserved. Humanity survives. Animals survive. And when the waters finally begin to recede, the world begins again. The ark comes to rest. Dry land appears, and Noah steps out into a world that has been completely transformed. The final moment of the story introduces a covenant. God promises that the earth will never again be destroyed by a flood, and the rainbow placed in the clouds becomes the sign of that promise. The flood narrative therefore becomes one of the most dramatic turning points in the early chapters of Genesis. It reveals the seriousness of human corruption. It reveals the consequences that follow when violence fills the earth. But it also reveals something else. Even in the midst of judgment, preservation and renewal remain part of the story. The world continues, human history moves forward, and the story of Genesis continues to unfold. If you enjoy exploring these moments in Scripture and examining the deeper meaning behind the events recorded in the Bible, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on the video. This series is walking step by step through the book of Genesis, exploring the early chapters of the biblical narrative and examining how the foundations of the human story are revealed in Scripture. And in the next episode, we will continue this journey into the world after the flood. Because once the waters disappear and humanity begins again, a new question begins to emerge. How will the next generation shape the world that has just been restored? And the answer to that question leads directly to the next major moment in the book of Genesis.